Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Koshin West. I'm the founder of Integral Transformative Bodywork. My pronouns are he, him, and we are coming to you for another ITB Sunday School. It is July 19th. July is Shadow Month, and as per this Shadow Month, today we're going to talk about a specific topic having to do with how to work personal shadow compared to working collective shadow. We're going to kind of talk about what those two are, to kind of define them to a certain extent, and then talk about how to relate to collective shadow and how to work collective shadow. And if you actually can, what does that actually look like? And is there a probability of that? So we're going to go ahead and move forwards with that. It is going to behoove you to look at the past to what's it called, Sunday schools on shadow, because we're going to be basically assuming the knowledge of those two as we go forwards. We're not going to have much of a recap on this stuff. We're going to use some generalized terms, and we're not going to jump into too much of what we've covered already. But we will try and translate as best as I can here. Okay. All right. So let's first and foremost do a quick little cover of what shadow is. Shadow material is a part of every human being. Every human being has shadow. It is not an evil thing. It is basically where, if we have, as human beings, if we have been raised to kind of disown elements of our humanity, parts of ourselves, and it doesn't matter what parts of ourselves, what makes us up. It doesn't matter what you've disowned. It's the disowning of that for whatever reason as you were raised and as you came through maturity. So that makes up a portion of shadow. What also makes up a portion of shadow is your trauma, and specifically, not just trauma, specifically unintegrated trauma. So trauma that has not been processed, has not been engaged, has not been worked through. So that is the term for shadow. And what goes for the personal shadow is what goes for the collective shadow. So shadow is not something we really get rid of. Okay, there's no end to it. We can work angles. We can work from a personal perspective. We can work angles of it. We can integrate as best we can the material that we have disowned. But since human beings evolve in a spiral and continue to grow as well as deepen, become more complex and experience more unity, since they become more along the way as the years tick by, that means it changes how we see and how we relate and how we experience and integrate things that have happened to us in the past. So if there's traumas that have occurred in our life, we have a different relationship to them and a different opportunity to heal from them in our 20s compared to our 30s, compared to our 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. So this means that our relationship evolves our relationship evolves to shadow and shadow material and everything that goes along with recovery as far as that's concerned. So we want to keep in mind that shadow is always a part of what's going on in our lives. Shadow is always a part of every relationship that we have, whether that be a one-on-one relationship or a relationship of a group. It's always there. Our goal is not to kill shadow as if it's this, once again, this monster, this bad thing. It's not meant to vanquish it or to kill it or to do all the work in the world so I don't have any shadow anymore. That's kind of a misnomer about shadow work. The thing we want to do with shadow work is to evolve and evolve our relationship to it and make our relationship to it more healthy and more transparent, and allow for shadow to inform us just like any other voice inside of us, any other kind of awareness or any kind of mode of perceiving reality inside of us. So we want to keep shadow in a healthy relationship. We want to maintain a good relationship to shadow. Most people don't, all right? Most groups don't, mostly because there is a lack of literacy and thus a lack of fluency in the world of, first and foremost, just psychological health in and of itself, what makes a human being, and then also what psychological health is, and then also what shadow work is and how shadow fits into these things. So there is an absence, very much so, in our culture and pretty much all cultures, from what I've experienced and from what we've assessed so far. is that this conversation of shadow, even though there may be some folks that know terms about shadow, there's still a fair bit of uh, lack of literacy, lack of experience, lack of fluency. That's actually one of the reasons why ITB is in place, is to hopefully counteract some of that reality, counteract some of that problem that we have, counteract that gap in our education as humans. So what goes for the individual very much goes for the collective. And when we talk about collective shadow is basically anytime two or more people get together. It doesn't really matter how big your group is. The context doesn't change all that much. Some of the other elements that we'll talk about will change a little bit. But when we start looking at large groups, when we start looking at cities, states, countries, swaths of people, generations, groups of people, using any type of group identifier. A lot of the same things apply. A lot of the work is very different, and it's one individual in relationship to this grand shadow. So just like any individual, excuse me, any individual, a group will have its own material and shadow based off of the same contexts. So when we look at a group may leave out a certain portion of their humanity. And a reminder here, we've talked about this in the past, a reminder here, the kind of baseline for what we call our humanity is the integral map. So if you're interested in understanding when I say humanity, and you're wondering maybe to yourself, well, what do you mean by humanity? What is the standard of what you're calling a human being? We use the integral map founded by Ken Wilber and supported by the integral community. If you want to check that out, go to integrallife.com and you'll see more information having to do with that. This map is the most, in my opinion, but then also those that are like investigating this question of what makes humans humans, it is probably by far the most thorough example of what a human is made up of, how a human participates in reality, and what are the components of every human being around the world. So this is a beautiful map. It's an exciting map. It's a complex map, and it's also very informative. And so when we talk about humanity, we're not just talking about Jeff's idea of that. That could be actually because I'm not the most educated human being in the world and all these things. That would be kind of myopic, but we are pointing to a map founded by the greatest minds in the world heretofore that have contributed to the integral map in some form or fashion. And this pulls from both ancient peoples, traditions, and findings, as well as leading edge, cutting edge information in science as far as we have it right now. So the integral map is really kind of the baseline and the story of what we consider a human to be and how a human functions. What every human has access to as far as this known universe that we occupy. Beyond that, that's what we are considering our humanity. So when a group gets together, if a group gets together and starts to maybe omit or even like consciously rail against a certain component of their humanity, i.e. the integral map, then that's where they're creating shadow. Whether they're doing it consciously or unconsciously, it really doesn't matter. It's still going to create shadow for the group. So a great example is in the religion community, and I apologize ahead of time for any kind of Catholics out there. The Catholic community has a real issue with dealing with that line of intelligence and the component of humanity, which is sexuality, and honoring relationships and violations in relationship to shadow or in relationship to sexuality within the church. I mean, they've been found several times to have serious transgressions. And so that community has a mind-boggling issue with a shadow in relationship to sex and sexuality and things along those lines. Obviously, and obviously they're struggling with that, and some people say, including myself, they could do so much more. But the reality is that every population will have shadow in relationship to something, primarily because they are most likely, as a group, collectively uninformed about the full spectrum of humanity, the full spectrum of what it means to be human. To take it out of something as dramatic as the Catholic Church, we can say something along the lines of when, like a very relevant conversation that's going on these days is having to do with gender and sexuality, and what is masculinity, what is femininity. And for populations that identify as having male bodies and considering themselves men, masculinity is a big fucking mystery for a lot of them, because there is an long-standing storyline that masculinity is this very specific box and femininity is a very specific box. And if a person that identifies as a male does not fit themselves into that box, then they don't, you know, they can have their male card or the masculinity card rejected or something like that, or taken back. And so this is another perfect example of the rigidity of a group of people. And they're not even a organized collective. It is kind of like a cultural perspective. It's a cultural agreement that is both overt and has a whole lot of covert components to it. And they're leaving out, to their incredible detriment, this whole portion of their humanity. So if male and masculinity is this box, the rest of the spectrum of their humanity is just kind of left out. And this creates a huge amount of shadow. All right, this is a serious, serious problem in where these communities kind of rely. If you identify as male and if you're living in this quote unquote male body experience, then these are major hurdles that you have to navigate and make your way through and unpack that shadow material and deal with that storyline. So one way that we can think of collective shadow is think of the stereotypes that we oftentimes project onto groups. Stereotypes are there for very good reasons, all right? Stereotypes are there because they come from a certain amount of accuracy, okay? They don't tell the whole truth about everyone, but stereotypes tell a story with a certain amount of accuracy. And that's very problematic because you have a certain amount of accuracy, but then you're also, they're false because they're leaving out the whole of the humanity and the potential for that whole of humanity, that whole human or that whole humanity of the group to actually show up and be alive. So this is wicked, wicked problematic. So when it comes to collective shadow or a community shadow, it's just pretty much the same as what's going on for a personal shadow experience, just multiplied by sometimes millions. Every group has shadow. Every group must come to terms with this shadow. And how a group does that is based off of their literacy and their ability to educate, and then their ability to engage that shadow material in a not just an individual way, but then also a cultural way, a group collective way. So that's kind of where collective shadow comes from and what it is. It is pesky, it is nefarious, it is deeply embedded, it's difficult stuff. And we humans have a real issue pulling apart the realities of our collective shadow. And then very much so in places like the US, we have an incredibly hard time dealing with it because we are so hyper individuated. We believe, or a lot of folks believe, that if I just do my part and I engage and I engage my shadow and I work my shadow, then it will cause everything to be okay. And if just enough people did that, everything would be fine. And there's a certain amount of accuracy to this. This is also a dangerous position to take, to only work in the personal field or in the internal circle of themselves. Of course, that's extremely helpful. It's important for you to work your own shadow work. But if your community, and if you do not engage your community's shadow, if your community doesn't engage their shadow, and if you do not engage community shadow, then more or less these things just perpetuate beyond you, because the group will certainly outlive you as an individual, and it will just carry on the shadow material into the following generations. So this is kind of what we face as far as shadow is concerned. This is our collective shadow is concerned. Also, this country is dealing with, the US has been dealing with for the past probably 40, 50 years, has seriously been faced with dealing with collective shadow on a regular basis, having to do with racism, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia. I mean, the list kind of goes on. And the reason why it kind of keeps going on and on is because we are hyper individualistic and we don't quite know what to do with collective shadow. And honestly, I mean, collective shadow is not a field that a lot of people write in. It's not a field that a lot of people have done research in. We're just now starting to get a handle on it and start to get some ideas about it. But what I am putting forth in this video is that there is a way forwards, and it has to be integrally informed, and it has to have, in order to deal with collective shadow, a lot of the same things that we do for personal shadow have to be applied to the collective. And so this is kind of how I suggest relating to collective shadow and how we ought to proceed as a group, whether we're facing the conversation of racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, whatever the story is, whatever the shadow element is concerned, how we go forwards with that. So let's see. So first and foremost, let's talk about, I'm going to start with like the work of dealing with disowned, with collective shadow as a group, what our groups can do, what our communities can start building, what will be needed in a community for them to start to deal with the collective shadow material, start to engage collective shadow material, start to integrate collective shadow material. And then we'll kind of finish up the back end of this with what should you do, what should each individual do and think in relationship to dealing with collective shadow and practices and different things along those lines that I'm suggesting and I've found to be helpful for others and others have found helpful for themselves as they perform their engagement of this collective shadow. So dealing with collective shadow as we begin here, like I said, two primary things that shadow is made up of is disowned elements of humanity, i.e. the integral map, and trauma. And so when we start to think of answering the question of how do we engage and then process and integrate collective shadow, it's not a bad idea to kind of break up those two. And there are some similarities between the two of them, but we're going to take them kind of one at a time. So first off, we're going to start with the disowned elemental material, disowned material of our humanity. So in order to change this, there has to be an assessment of the community. There has to be an assessment of the group. Now, whether in this case, I'm kind of going to be speaking at large groups, meaning states or cities, states, countries, different things along those lines, or large swaths of people, large, undefined by politics kind of groups of people. That means religious orientations. That means color of skin groups. That means what's it called? The actual political parties can be helpful. That also means generational groups can be clumped into this. This also can be regional as far as not so much country or state, but having to do with portions of a region or something along those lines, meaning the South or the North or different things along those lines. So as we start to look into the disowned elements component of things, what we first have to do is make space for the elements within a pre-existing system. So we have to start with some education first and foremost. We have to decide, we have to take an assessment of our group that we're a part of, that we make up. We have to take an assessment of that and start to look and find out where are shadow elements, where do these things live, what are our blind spots. This can be very, very helpful in large groups of people. This actually can be very helpful to actually listen to the people that we're ostracizing. So if we go with something like racism, one of the great things that white folks can do is listen to the needs of persons of color. So that's a great way to kind of identify where shadow is at. That's a great beginning spot. Oftentimes, beginners to shadow can be very, very blind to their behavior and how their behavior can hurt other people and can subjugate other people and cause problems for other people. And what we want to do is we want to first start by kind of taking an account of what are we made up of, what are we doing, what's our activity, what's our behavior. We then want to start educating about what are the base elements of our humanity. First and foremost, if we're going to use the integral map, we also have to be kind of educated in the integral map and finding out what we left out. That can also be a wonderful route of finding what we've left out. So, but it always is good to have an outside consultant for that experience. For a collective, the nice thing is that there's usually no shortage of people that will criticize a group, whether that's criticism coming from the inside of the group or criticism coming from the outside of the group. So some people suggest that you shouldn't listen to your critics and that critics are just haters and different things along those lines. And there's a certain amount of wisdom to that. Of course, when one is deciding their own journey, that can be really helpful. For a collective, it can be helpful only to a certain degree, but we also want to pay attention to what critics have to say and measure that, because they may be offering some insight that we have a blind spot to. So we don't want to just, fall hook, line, and sinker for whatever new critic offers up to us, but we do want to be very discerning based off of this. And we do this because we know we're humans. We know we are. We know we have this tendency to have shadow and miss things and be a damn mess. And so this can be a very wonderful way to kind of get this started, listening to critics, both internal and external, registering the integral map and starting to look seriously, very discerningly and very seriously at what makes up your community and what makes up, what do we include in our community from the integral map and what we exclude from our community in the integral map regarding the integral map. And we want to become very, 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 very sensitive to that experience. And also, when we're assessing our own community, we have to be kind of mindful of being willing to be flexible with traditions, being flexible with age-old held beliefs. Just like an individual human being, we have to be ready to burn what is not helpful anymore and to keep what is working. And so that is a very tough story. That is a very difficult thing to sometimes discern, both personally and as a collective, definitely. And then we have to kind of go forwards with some of that stuff. So we want to educate. We need to we must get an assessment of our community. We must get an assessment to try and find these gaps. We then have to start to apply the integral map in relationship to them. We have to start looking for what we've omitted as far as the integral map is concerned. And then we have to start doing the actual engagement and the work of the shadow work. So the becoming educated in it and starting to create conversations for that can be extremely helpful, but that doesn't really matter as far as like the integration of shadow. The reality of shadow is that you can talk shit about your shadow and talk your shadow to death if you want. But the reality is that until you start engaging the material that you've disowned, shadow work isn't being done. You're basically just paying lip service to shadow. And so from a collective perspective, we have to kind of do the same thing that we would do for the personal experience, which is we have to start carving out space in our precious calendar in order to dedicate it to creating opportunities for shadow to be processed. So what we've done so far in this model, we've suggested that we discern, we become educated about the integral map. We see where we're missing things in our community in regarding to the integral map. We then become discerning about what we're going to keep and what we're going to get rid of. And then we have to start creating we have to educate and we have to create some fluency for conversations and for articulation to happen. And at the same time, as we are educating and we are creating fluency, we have to then start to find social spaces. We need to make rooms, physical places, not just digital ones, but physical places for people to explore that material, for people to engage and work the problems that their shadow has created for them. So if we take something like that conversation of masculinity I brought up a little bit earlier, the reality is that we need to start putting people in there needs to be an education of males and male identifying human beings that are stuck in these possible spaces, an education towards them to become fluent in what the totality of their humanity is, and then create an opportunity for these human beings to not only talk about those things, but then also engage practices that change, that have an opportunity to integrate and open up in order to start to relate to that material that has so solidly been pushed out. Now, remember, any community, or I should say, if we start with the individual, any individual starting to engage shadow, one of the first things they're going to experience are resistance. So what should we expect with the population, with a collective shadow? That's exactly right. Resistance from the collective. The collective is going to think you're attacking them, most likely. Because oftentimes when we start to push the edges of any confines of a group, how the group defines itself, how the group identifies itself, you're going to be met with resistance because there's a sense of loss of identity that may be coming up. That's true for the individual, that's true for the collective. It's oftentimes one of the most difficult things, one of the most difficult hurdles to move through. And there needs to be then thus representation inside of the community in order to change that momentum. So you have this box, which are male identifying human beings thinking that masculinity is this one thing. We then introduce through that community, not so much for, it's going to be difficult from an outside, but from the inside, we have to start communicating that what the integral map is, and that humanity, that masculinity is bigger than just this little box. That masculinity is a product of their humanity, not the other way around. Their masculinity doesn't make them a human. It's human that makes them a male-bodied experienced creature. And that their humanity is so much bigger than the box that they have defined, or that the culture has defined, the collective has defined as their quote unquote masculinity. So that actually, a lot of this stuff has to be an inside job to a certain extent, having to do with representation, but then also actually empowering people, empower changing infrastructural activities. So it is good for the individual to start questioning this within a community, but it's also important to have people in power to start to represent these things and express these things. So within a collective experience, there can then start to be this conversation that happens, and then creating spaces for people, for human beings to start to experience the rest of their humanity. And this means that as far as a culture is concerned, we have to create brick and mortar spaces or digital online education spaces for people to start exploring this information and becoming more fluent. We need coaches and guides to support people as they go through this stuff, to discern some of these things, to hold their hand as they go through the heartache of uncovering this material. And as we go through the process of uncovering and reclaiming shadow and starting to reclaim our elements, these spaces have to be sustainable. They have to be spaces and territories where people can actually have the experiences of their humanity, and they can start to be supported, not safe. I'm not going to use the word safe. We don't need that space to be ultimately safe, because there's honestly, there's not a lot of safety in what's it called? Shadow work. Doing shadow work is a dangerous act. It's a risky act. It's walking on the edge of a cliff type of an experience. It risks who I am. It's dangerous to my history and my perspective of reality. So safety is within a certain degree. Obviously, we want to create a certain amount of safety, but safety needs to be kind of honored as something that can only exist within a certain spectrum. And we do need to create a risky activity, and risk, when supported, can be a really, really wonderful recipe for transformation to occur. So these territories, these spaces, these brick and mortar spaces, as well as online spaces, they need to be supportive. They need to be honoring of the risk. They need to afford a certain amount of safety to a certain extent, but then also have to create an opportunity for risk and supported risk in order for that human and that collective to start to explore itself and redefine itself. So when we start to engage collective shadow as far as the disowned material is concerned, we do need to actually create outside spaces for these things. It's so much more than just conversational. It's so much more than reading a few books. For us human beings as a collective to recover from our disowning of our elemental self, we need public spaces to exercise these things, to practice these things, to explore these things. And since the integral map talks about stage development, and a lot of what's it called, human stage development and human progression, not only from a physical perspective, but then also from perspective experience. So physiological shifts as well as perspective changes as the human being becomes more and more sophisticated and integrated. We have to talk about stage of development, and that certain stages of development need certain things. And so this is where things get very, very complex, because now we're talking about not only collective shadow, but we're talking about the stages of development of that collective group. And this can get very, very, very exciting and very complex and very difficult to work with. If we stick with the typical mainstream type of a tradition, or not mainstream, but the traditional guidelines of what masculine is, and thus the counterpart shadow, which is the misogyny and the sexism that goes along with it, that stage of development is more or less like a rules and roles stage of development shadow. So masculinity has shadow at that rules and roles stage of development. The rules and roles stage of development for human beings is exactly what it sounds like. It's when human beings are trying to understand what are the rules of the community and the universe. What are the role? What role do I play in this community and this universe? So, what's most important is this look at what am I doing as far as my stage development is concerned. What is my point? What is the reason? How am I supposed to function in this group of people? And that is a relatively medium to low level of adulthood stage of development. And that's kind of where a lot of masculinity got kind of wrapped up and lost. And so there is this storyline that males are supposed to be this one specific thing. And it comes from that stage of development, finding the meaning of itself based off of what jobs I can do, what roles can I play. And if I can't play those roles and do those jobs, my worth is extremely questionable. My worth drops the less I can do and the less roles I can take. So this is a major contributor to traditional masculinity and one of its primary shadow materials. And it comes from a very, very kind of young age stage of development. We're talking about like probably 10, 12, 13, 14 years old stage of development. And a lot of the people who identify with this type of masculinity and have a lot of shadow in this stage of masculinity, boy, they just have a hard time seeing themselves as worthy without performing some great feat, without bringing home the bacon, or without being able to perform a great job or know how to do all these skills. There's a sense of self-worth that is very, very absent. They don't have any inherent worth if they can't do the job, or if they can't hold a role. And if they can't perform the role and do the job, then they don't have a whole lot of worth. And so this is a major issue. This is a major shadow. It's a denying of the rest of their humanity, the denying of their being. It's a denying of their inherent worth that every human being has. And so this is a major issue. And so coming from this perspective, we have to have institutions that understand this is shadow material having to do with a certain stage of development. That means we have to have stage appropriate schools. We have to have stage appropriate gyms. We have to have stage appropriate institutions of all kinds in the world, churches that kind of identify and understand what these things are, and understand that there is an option to kind of grow through these types of things, and to have people that are running these experiences supporting the growth through these things. So what might this look like? Wonderful question. So if we talk about something as simple as like a church or a religious institution or a spiritual institution. So one of the best ways to create healthy collective humans, healthy and decrease collective shadow, is to honor our humanity, is to honor all the elements of our humanity. And so in a religious institution, or even a public education type of an institution, becoming fluent at early ages, in that kind of late elementary school, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, having more and more of a conversation about what is the breadth and landscape and depth of being human, and then making opportunities for these young people to learn about these human experiences and about what makes them a whole human being. and that it's their responsibility and opportunity to explore these different territories, and then creating institutions, churches as well as public schools or religious institutions, creating opportunities for these human beings to start exploring their dynamism in different directions. Now, this is scary as shit to public schools. This is scary as shit to most religious institutions, because most of these places are meant to create a very specific guideline about what a human being, what a citizen is supposed to be, what a religious participant is supposed to look like. And this means that there's got to be some openings in these communities that allow for the exploration of their humanity. Meaning, if you're in a part of a religious community, there's got to be a space and education guidelines for you to explore your different, if we go with a binary perspective of gender, your masculinity and femininity, and how they unify into one human being, making you. There has to be opportunities to explore different states of consciousness, to explore your body and your physical awareness and different things along those lines, to explore your mental emotional experiences, to play with the mind, to explore altered states of consciousness, to inquire about mushrooms, hallucinogenic experiences, doing breath work, exploring the depth and breadth of the human mental, psychological experience, exploring that territory. And I'm literally talking about, there ought to be buildings and spaces where you have coaches supporting people doing breath work, supporting people doing mushroom experiences, supporting people in their exploration of their sexuality, moving into altered states, teaching people meditation, teaching people any kind of activity to allow them to explore their mind in their own pace, in their own territory, in their own experience of finding that unfolding, and create institutions for those things to occur. And so this is literally what we're shooting for, is enough of a territory for these things to kind of bloom. Because if you have a human being, an individual human being who has the potentiality to explore their wholeness individually, that's great. But if they don't have a community to go out into, it usually creates resentment. And then you get shit like fucking Unabombers, you get all kinds of terrorism experiences, you have people who have incredible anxiety issues, incredible crippling depression and anxiety and other kinds of mental psychological issues, because there's no community that they can find themselves in. There's no community that they can share these things in. And when you have an individual that's really nicely developed, they run the risk of having some real major hangups in relationship to not having a place to experience themselves and express their ideas and feel comfortable in their own skin and their own mind-body experience. And so they can oftentimes, with human beings that do get developed and do relatively well in relationship to that stuff, they can move into these communities and interact to a certain extent, but oftentimes, because those communities are very rigid and very kind of specific to that community, and they have a very relatively rigid kind of outline about what you're supposed to be in that community, their wholeness never gets to show up. So part of creating an opportunity for collective shadow to diminish, for collective shadow to decrease, and for wholeness and vividness of the population to unfold is literally creating territories and spaces and systems that support human development through these stages, human development from the perspective of the integral map. This is a huge freaking undertaking, okay? This is not a little deal. This is a huge thing. But it is something that is doable as long as there is a collective that's in power, a group that is in power that can allow for these spaces to unfold. And allow for this education to unfold. Now, when that'll happen, who the fuck knows? I mean, that's a good guess on that one. It's a tough order, but it's definitely doable. It's workable. It's just, it's gonna take more than just one human being, obviously. To a certain extent, a lot of what we're talking about here is to create an opportunity to legalize humanity, make it okay to be human, make it okay to be a whole human being. Because right now, in a lot of our cities, states, and our country, and different countries around the world, it is not legal to be a human being. It's not okay. You can't go explore your psyche. You can only explore the portions of your psyche that are deemed safe by past history collective bodies. And of course, we need collective bodies. That's important. We need social structures and spaces. But the other reality is that we also need to make sure we create spaces where people are free to move into these territories, explore their identity, have support exploring their identity. And it doesn't have to be the whole 100% community, but there has to be communities in place to support their exploration, to support their wholeness. And so the hope is that in creating these territories, these regions, these spaces, both in digital world and in art and physical space, these territories for people to explore these things, to have support, to have safety going through that experience, for there to be that in place, that will decrease collective shadow. That will decrease the probability of these horrible outbursts and this horrible, just systematic entitlement, systematic subjugation of different populations and different things along those lines. Just horrendous stuff that comes up when collective shadow is not engaged. So this is a way to create an opportunity for people to, for a community to start to own their humanity, start to feel their humanity, start to explore their humanity, and give people permission to just simply be human and legalize their humanity. Legalize that it's okay to have sex and to have a relationship and marry who you want to marry. Explore your psyche, explore your capabilities of the mind. Get high, get bombed out of your mind, and explore the nature of your psychedelic experience. Explore your sexuality in a safe way. Explore what gender means to you. Explore all the territories of being human if you want to go into those territories, and support human beings exploring those territories. So this is a way that we can decrease collective shadow based off of the problem of disowned elements. So this is very much a regular activity that can be put in place, and that is just matter of fact of setting up the right resources and institutions for these things to occur. A certain amount of agreement for people to do these things. Examples of this are very much showing up in different portions of the world. Examples of places that allow for humans to be humans. We see this a fair bit in Colorado. We see this in here in the States. We see it in West Coast states and cities kind of often. There's a little bit more openness as far as what makes a human being a human being. We also see this in Netherlands. We see relatively functional things happening there. There's a few other examples around the world where humans are can explore themselves and have support exploring themselves and find their way through the process, and have support as far as being a human is concerned. We've got a long way to go as far as all of the humans on the planet. We've got a very long way to go, but that's just kind of the game. That's kind of how shadow work goes. So moving from shadow from disowned elements, moving towards trauma, shadow coming from trauma, human beings, swaths of human beings go through the same types of things that an individual goes through as far as trauma is concerned. When we, if we stick with just what's gone on in the US, when we have traumatic experiences collectively, it very much defines who we are, and it very much defines, we are very much defined by how we integrate that stuff. Now, when it comes to dealing with trauma and with disowned elements, what's really helpful is representation at the top, okay? People who are perceived as having power, and power meaning power over resources. These individuals, just like a chief or chieftain or medicine person within a tribe in ancient times, or in certain portions of the country or certain portions of the world at this point in time, having a leader guide us through the process of engaging trauma and dealing with trauma and showing what trauma looks like is exceptionally helpful. All right. This means that we need leaders, and doesn't mean just the biggest leader. It means that we need a number of different types of representation leaders to tell the story of what trauma looks like, to give themselves permission to be humans, to show themselves as humans, to show themselves going through a process, and also talking about what processes need to be done for them, talking about that experience and sharing that experience with humanity. So oftentimes a collective, a country, can experience wonderful recovery through its leaders. So when we see a leader that's believable to us, maybe not believable to everybody, but believable to us, when we resonate with a leader and we see that leader mourn, and we see that leader evolve as a human being, this can have a very, because of the nature of empathy, this can have a very powerful effect on our brain and a very powerful effect on our behavior, and actually can do a certain amount of mourning for us. So when we see someone in a leader position that we think that we can resonate with to a certain extent, that we empathize with to a certain extent, when we see that, when we see them go through that recovery or go through that mourning process, it increases the probability for us, since they are a holder of power in our unconscious and in our psyche, it can have a powerful effect for doing some of the work for us. So seeing someone do mourning actually opens up a huge opportunity for us to integrate. And this goes back to a lot of our tribal stuff in the days of old, when our indigenous ancestors around the world. We used to do collective mournings. We used to do collective trauma recovery. And that's kind of what we suggest in ITB, is if you're going to talk about collective trauma, collective shadow from trauma, you then have to create collective recovery situations, collective opportunities for recovery to occur. And this was actually something that we buried, as far as the US is concerned, we kind of buried these in holidays. So we bury a lot of our ancient kind of shamanic and magical holiday rituals in current holidays, having to do with Mother's Day, Father's Day, Christmas, and different holidays along those lines for the Christian world. Our different holidays having to do with Memorial Day and Veterans Day, Earth Day. There's a major component that we sometimes don't even see. There's a major component to those holidays that point to, we have trauma from these experiences. We've got trauma, and we're going to use this specific day to memorialize, to recognize the losses, the hurts, the transgressions that we've either performed or have had done to ourselves. And we're going to honor that in a way that creates an opportunity for all of us to mourn that are a part of this group. Now, of course, a perfect sign that we have really shitty guidance as far as as far as mourning is concerned, is look what's happened to most of our holidays. So something as significant as Veterans Day or Memorial Day, which is meant to honor those who have committed their lives and died and paid major prices or been crippled and had to continue on, our veterans, or the Memorial Day and honoring the history of human beings and honoring the history of war and taking a moment of those things and taking a moment for that stuff. Like, the reality of these two events, the primary thing people identify with is it's a day off and we can go shopping because they're shopping events. And this is clearly a sick representation of the point of that recovery, the point of that ritual of recovery. Whereas as far as the history of, something like Memorial Day, good Lord, at some point in time, and I believe it was World War I, or World War II, and during Memorial Day, I mean, both sides, the German and the German and the and Allied forces, they literally stopped for a period of time and just kind of honored that experience. I may have my history off a little bit on that, but this was an event that occurred. Everybody kind of stopped at a certain specific time on Memorial Day to just go silent, to stop what they were doing, and to honor the lost, honor what we have given, what we've sacrificed, what we've had to, and also hopefully honor kind of what we've won, and also honor the fact that we've had to do some shitty things. And so a lot of collective mourning kind of got pushed into holidays, and then holidays got kind of commercialized, and we really lost a sense of mourning collectively. We've really lost a sense of, honoring death, honoring trauma, honoring our transgressions, both put upon us and that we visited on other people. There's been a real loss of that, and that's been from the top down type of an experience, type of a loss. Very rarely do we really see a full engagement of these types of things. And that's essentially what's needed for healing collective trauma, is creating opportunities for us, for human beings who are interested in healing this collective trauma, in gathering together, in having mourning ceremonies, in having both mourning ceremonies that are both conversational, but then also movement based, but then also supporting unconscious levels of trauma and stuff that can't be touched by just talking about things or just some movement. So one wonderful way of doing this that I will oftentimes suggest is, for collective trauma, we ought to be doing breathes. We ought to be doing breath work in order to allow for that collective trauma. Breath work with a specific intention towards healing the collective trauma that we are burdened by being a part of a collective, creating an opportunity for us to move into these altered states as a group with the singular intention of integrating the trauma having to do with a specific event. This could very much create a probability for deep integration and deep decrease of stress for human beings. We see some pretty good preliminary evidence in smaller groups for this. So when we couple conversational, like relatively normal psychotherapy and counseling activities, as well as these types of altered state collective experiences to be shared and to wail together, to rage together, to fall apart together, and then to come back together with a meal or reconciliation activities. Going through these types of rituals can be very powerful for the collective to move forwards. We see this in the animal kingdom with our primates. These are mourning ceremonies that have been performed, and these are agitations that primates have performed in order to deal with losses within a group through poaching or some other type of death. When the group experiences a trauma, they will oftentimes they will have these collective gatherings of grooming, of sometimes having, what appears to be, as far as their facial expressions, deep emotional sharing experiences together, as well as oftentimes movement and shaking and different things along those lines in order to process what's gone on for them. So it's one of those things that we see as far as the primate community is concerned. It's also something we've seen in smaller communities around the world process trauma together. And then it's a matter of kind of continuing to celebrate these things and recognize things. So from an ITB perspective, what I have put forward several times in group conversations is we ought to kind of take back our holidays, and instead of saying we have sales for Memorial Day, for Veterans Day, for Father's Day, Mother's Day, instead of having for Earth Day, instead of doing sales, all that shit gets shut down, and then we just create situations where we sit together, we talk about our losses, we talk about what we've sacrificed, we do breath work or use mushrooms or ayahuasca and do rituals having to do to move into these altered states to allow for the trauma that can't be touched by language and sharing in a group, to have that trauma with a group and to reach that stuff and have that opportunity to move into an altered state for that trauma to be integrated, and then come together in a post activity in order to share again, and then to do some type of group activity of building the community and building an opportunity to reconcile, to make amends, and then feasting together. These would be what I've described as a basic format of most ritual, mourning rituals or celebration rituals that we see in a lot of ancient peoples around the world. Basic model as far as that's concerned, and that would actually help us human beings that consider ourselves a first world country and so sophisticated. So these types of things, if we create spaces for them once again, and then create formats for them, and then create guides for them, and then hold those communities accountable and create guidelines and boundaries about how to hold them accountable and how to care for those communities. What we would start to see, theoretically, of course, what we would start to see is we'd start to see the decrease of collective shadow going on. We would legalize being human. We would educate folks on the human psyche and on shadow and create a fluent conversation for the majority of the population. We would then create institutions and spaces and designate holidays in order for us to celebrate these things collectively throughout the country, and then start going through the process of honoring what we've been through. And like I mentioned, as far as that stack is concerned, or the schedule is concerned, going through those processes and doing that every year, doing that as a regular practice. And this is what our ancient peoples did. And if you want to see like quote unquote a successful successful representation of group mourning and shadow integration, we just simply have to look at the collective practices of basically all of our the majority of our ancient peoples, as well as continuing to exist, what's it called, indigenous populations, and their indigenous practices. So it's one of those deals where we do have really good examples of this, and there's no real reason, just because we have a certain pigmentation of our skin, just because we've gone through public education, we think we're super educated and modern, doesn't mean modern or progressive and super special in that way, doesn't mean these old ways are not going to support our integration, our progression, our ability to heal and honor our lives and our fullness of our humanity, as well as give our fellow other human beings, as well as other living creatures on the planet, their opportunity to just be themselves. So this creates a really wonderful kind of space for these things to occur. So this is the model that ITB suggests as far as going out into social spaces and creating an opportunity for collective shadow to start to diminish. It's not simple. It's not easy. There is very little infrastructure in place at this point in time. We have so many people that have been traumatized. We have so many people who have mental instability because our institutions, our systems are not set up to support humans. They're not set up to support especially the totality and the diversity and dynamism of humanity. They're not in place. So there's more than enough fucking work for us to do, okay? There is no shortage of things to do. And of course, this is just one model that we're suggesting. And it's not just my suggestion. This is also comes from a lot of the integral community and the suggestion about that stuff, about how to create integral communities and functional communities. But it's also not out of the question. And it doesn't mean that only elite human beings should have this opportunity. There's no reason why on this planet anybody should really be going education free, healthcare free, or food free. Not have food. We have so many resources on this planet. There's just poor organization. So it's definitely something that can be done. There does have to be a lot of evolution to some of these systems. There does have to be some changes that have to occur as far as these systems are concerned. But when it comes to identifying collective shadow, this is oftentimes how we can do it. And these are some ideas about how to proceed in relationship to them. So now what I'd like to present is probably a little bit more for your personal use. So what do I do? When personally facing collective shadow, what do you suggest, right? What is the plan? When you are personally going out into the world to face and work with collective shadow, these are our suggestions. These suggestions are mine, but then also come from other sources, from tons of different sources having to do with self-care, counseling, working as a caregiver, and also as far as our integral map is concerned. And also personally, this stuff comes from me going out into the world and doing my own engagement of collective shadow and supporting other people as they've gone out to engage collective shadow and work with people who have been engaging collective shadow for a very long time. So this comes from not only personal experience, but tried experience with other human beings that they found successful, and then also reference material that I've collected along the way, having to do with caregiving, healthcare, social justice, working with systems, history, different things along those lines. So when we're personally facing collective shadow, what I have found to be extremely helpful that we have to adjust is we cannot identify success the same way personally to collectively. So personal shadow work success is we have some pretty quick evidence. When I personally do my own shadow work, when an individual does their own shadow work and starts working that stuff, they will most likely see positive shifts and positive changes within a relatively short time. They're also with themselves all the time, which means they're going to start to notice shifts. They're going to start to notice the work that's being done. They're going to see the work that's being done. They're going to have a firsthand experience of their own interpersonal shadow experience and processing and integrating shadow, whatever it comes from. When you're working with the collective, though, as an individual engages the collective, you mostly don't see that stuff. So this is why I suggest you must adjust your version of success. Most people judge success of shadow work based off of what they see and evidence that's revealed. There's a really high probability when you go out into the world and start engaging the collective shadow, and doing that through working with the homeless, or being an educator, being a health caregiver, being a social justice representative, or moving into politics in and of themselves, we do have to kind of adjust our perspective of success, because we will most likely be projecting onto the collective success is supposed to look like XYZ, right? But we don't get to see the interiors of the collective. We don't go home with everybody that we've worked with. We don't go home with everybody that we've touched. We don't go home. If I'm in a larger power position as far as a council position is concerned, and I'm actually making some decisions on behalf of a larger community, I'm not going to see the interiority of every human being that my decisions impact. So this means that our barometer, our context for success has to be adjusted to a certain extent. And we have to kind of abandon the projection that recovery is going to look the way we want it to look. Recovery is going to happen within our time frame. That recovery and integration is going to follow a specific set of events, set of markers. So what we notice about working with collective shadow is actually similar to what we run into as far as personal shadow, which is you discover how you integrate. There's no sure thing, there's no sure path to recovery and to integration for the individual or for the collective. So when we engage the collective, we have to mostly take a position of deep curiosity of seeing, all right, we've implemented these things, we're engaging the community this way, let's see what unfolds. So we have to kind of adjust our first suggestion is to adjust our perspective of what success is. And once again, we have to drop our projection of what recovery ought to look like. We have to drop our projection of how long recovery should take. We have to drop our projection of a timeline, and that we have to drop the projection that we're going to see the recovery we were expecting. And so these are difficult things for us to put down, because if you've been doing your own personal shadow work, you get to see all that shit. You get to see the change in your relationships. You go home with yourself on a regular basis. You're dealing with your shit on a regular basis. So you see the products of your work, and you also have an insider view of what needs to be tweaked here and there and how to adjust. You don't get that with collective. So there must be this kind of different perspective of success and support of the people that you're working with or contributing and offering to, into a very, very kind of wide open kind of, I'm presenting this and giving myself and giving this work over to this monster, to this collective shadow. And I'm giving this work, and I'm honoring the fact that I will not see, I may not, in my lifetime, I may not see a major decrease in the shadow, but it doesn't mean that I shouldn't be providing. I shouldn't be making the sacrifice. I shouldn't be doing the honorable work and the good work with these people. So this is a wonderful kind of a perspective to take in relationship to this. Next up, personal practices and self-care regimen. Those should be meant to sustain you, not to heal you. I see this very often with a lot of folks, both in the healthcare industry as well as in the social justice movements and representation movements, representation of underprivileged human being movements. The individuals go to those communities in order to heal themselves. They don't do their own work, and they don't heal themselves in the first place. They don't do their own personal shadow work. They don't do their own personal integration work. They don't do their own personal health and health care. What they do is they go to the community, and they think by healing the community, they're going to get healing within themselves. This is an extremely dangerous codependent orientation. By healing the community, you will not heal all of the portions of yourself. You will not integrate your shadow by going out there. You may be confronted with your shadow. You may be have a certain amount of healing occur, but you then have to take that home and still work your own personal stuff. So if you're consciously choosing to engage collective shadow, you have to have your own regimen already in place. We highly suggest you have your own practices of self-care, have a counselor, have a team of support, do your own education, do a lot of your own shadow work, take care of yourself, get your basic needs met on a regular basis, and be relatively solid as far as that's concerned, and then go out and contribute to the community. Then go out and contribute, and not look for the community to supply your rejuvenation, not to look for the community to supply your healthcare and your self-care and your healing work, but to very much also receive what they can give, but then also do a lot of your homework as well. Only looking to the community to heal yourself is a dangerous type of a situation. And that's where a lot of people put their eggs. A lot of folks I have run into think that the more they give to the community and the more they commit themselves and sacrifice of themselves to a community and to the work, so to speak, the more they believe they're going to get some type of self-healing or something along those lines. And it's really easy to kind of trick yourself into that, no doubt about it, because most of the time giving can get us high, and when we give and when we offer and when we sacrifice, it can definitely create a getting high experience, but that getting high experience doesn't equate to healing and self-care and different things along those lines. So we very, very, very much suggest that you have these things in place before you go out into the community, and start doing that work, and start contributing that way. Next up, we suggest to choose to disengage when appropriate. This means we suggest that when it's time to do the work, honor that you're choosing to shift and go and do the work and engage the community and engage the process, engage the work. And then when you're done doing that stuff, come home. Come back to your place, and then come back to your own humanity and understand that you're an individual in a collective that's working. Now, this is kind of like a Venn diagram. Your collective experience of your humanity and your interpersonal experience of your humanity, they are overlapped, something fierce. The I and the we territory, all the different territories of the 4 quadrants, I, we, it, and its, they are all intermeshed and overwhelmed and overlapping each other. That's normal and that's common and that's what's supposed to be. But what we want to do is we want to recognize that it is okay for me to just be human. I can go do the work, and then I'm kind of performing a role in the community. As I go out and do this work, I'm performing this role. And then when I come home, I can put that role down and just be a human being and just be in my own skin. And then inhabit different roles as I consciously choose. And that is the primary element that we suggest, is consciously choose these states, consciously choose these roles, these hats that you're wearing. This decreases the probability of you breaking down and having a freak out and running yourself, ragged and all that jazz. And so we definitely suggest that these are appropriate ways to kind of care for yourself and to continue to be able to go out into the world and engage. Regular refocus on values. Now, some of our greatest civil rights leaders, and recently, if you don't know if you're joining us for YouTube, recently we lost John Lewis just a few days ago, the civil rights leader. What we know about John Lewis, what we know about MLK, what we know about Malcolm X, what we know about a whole host of civil rights leaders and leaders who have very much shaped communities and redefined communities and been major figureheads for change, is that they are usually people of some type of faith. And faith is actually really, really helpful for actually engaging what's it called, collective shadow, because oftentimes the practice of the faith consistently aligns you with a value system. I'm not saying you have to go out and believe God, you have to go out and join a religion in order to do this, but what's inherent to those religions and the practices of those religions and the practices of those individuals in relationship to changing humanity was that there was a constant through oftentimes prayer, there was a constant practice of coming back to the values, constantly reciting what my values are, constantly connecting to the values that I am hoping to embody as I go out into the world. So regularly refocusing on your values, regularly coming home to your values, regularly speaking your values, relatively reminding yourself of those values, regularly reminding others of the values that you're hoping to support, giving other people to hold you permission to hold you accountable in relationship to those values, just continually focusing your attention and your awareness around those values in relationship to engaging collective shadow really grounds us into the heart and the compassion and the nurturing that is needed to engage collective shadow. Collective shadow is best dealt with, just like personal shadow, is best dealt with uh, by applying healthy boundaries and accountability, boatloads of compassion, and boatloads of nurturing. Okay, we kind of have to remember that aggression very rarely solves personal shadow as well as collective shadow. Now, I'm not saying we should all be nonviolent, peaceful folks that should never consider holding people accountable. That's not the case whatsoever. I hope you hear that. But the reality is that when we engage collective shadow, over dependence on aggression is usually problematic in relationship to shadow, because shadow will then just try and meet us as far as that aggression is concerned. And so usually personal shadow and collective shadow don't respond really well to these things. And we want to create an opportunity for us to understand that the primary ways that we have seen evidence of integration occur is consistent, healthy boundary maintenance and accountability practices, tons of compassion, and tons of nurturing. Okay, so these three elements are extremely helpful for going forwards in relationship to that, and no shortage of insight as well, and mindfulness as well. So we do want to refocus on our values. We very much want to spend a lot of time daily, especially if we're engaged in collective shadow on a regular basis. We want to be daily and almost hourly refocusing our attention on our values, hopefully in a verbal way, a psychological, emotional way, an embodied way, and through some type of physical movement, physical activity. This is why prayers of different kinds oftentimes engage not only verbal, but physical, sensual experiences, as well as a physical activity. So we do want to use the technology that has been handed down to us. Like I said, this does not mean you have to, if you identify as agnostic or atheist, this doesn't mean you have to find a faith at all. It has nothing to do with it. What we're doing is we're taking that reality from those institutions, and we're remembering one of the primary things that our great leaders have shown us has been that they constantly, through their faith and religion, constantly came back to focusing on what are the values. What am I holding? Am I holding compassion? Am I holding people accountable? Am I being nurturing? Am I being honest? Am I being clear? These types of elements are extremely helpful for facing no matter what position you hold, leader or just quote unquote foot soldier. Wonderful in dealing with collective shadow on the regular. And so this can create some really powerful types of changes in our humanity and in the collective shadow. Another thing that I would like, one of the last things here on, or another, not last thing, I misread my notes. The next thing we want to focus on, next suggestion we have is give others permission. Give humanity permission, okay? And this kind of goes hand in hand with perfectionism isn't appropriate for the personal, for an individual human being, nor is it appropriate to project onto them as a collective. So there's no possibility of perfection in an individual, and there's no possibility for perfection in a collective. What we must understand about shadow is that shadow lives in the world of the human experience, which means humans are a fucking mess. Which means a collective of humans is a big fucking mess. And so we can never expect perfectionism out of ourselves or out of other people. And this is a difficult one to carry because it really creates a lot of friction with accountability. But this is a philosophical orientation we very, very much suggest. And this is why we suggested accountability and good boundaries, and then compassion, and then nurturing. Because You very much need those other two in large doses to understand that humans are a fucking mess. If I take any individual through the process of being educated through ITB and facing their shadow, they fucking fail on a regular basis. I failed on a regular basis. If you've spent any time with addicts, they fail on a regular basis. There's literally a saying in a lot of AA groups that it's not a matter of when you're going to fall off the wagon. It's not a matter of if you're going to fall off the wagon. It's when you're going to fall off the wagon. So it's an understanding that we have to honor that humans are a mess. Humans are not robots. Humans are not automatons. You can't just read a couple books, offer some suggestion in an education institution, present facts, and then expect people to evolve. It's just not how we human beings work. It's not like downloading or changing some code in a computer program. It's very much about them going through this evolutionary growth process. And even if you had the best system for supporting humans becoming humans, even if you had the best systems in place in order to support a collective group, an individual or a collective processing trauma, even if you had the greatest systems in the world, it'd still be a fucking mess. You'd still have folks that just pop out and are like outliers and are issues and are problems and are manifestations of evolution that must deny these systems, that must push the edges and push out of these systems and exist outside of these systems. So one of the other wonderful things we suggest to you if you are going to engage collective shadow is drop perfectionism as best as you can. Remind yourself that no individual nor collective will ever be perfect and unfold the way you want them to be. So we suggest give others permission to be a work in progress. When you do this interpersonal work, when you do your own trauma work, when you do your own shadow work, you have to give yourself permission to be a art, to be a work in progress, to be a thing that's growing and evolving and is juicy and is phenomenal and is a fucking shit show at times. And so there's gotta be permission to just be human along the way. We also want to give others permission to be horrible, to be a mess, to fail, and to try again. All right. This is, once again, a very difficult thing for us in our current culture to kind of honor. We have to honor that even if a person looks wonderful and appears really great, there's probably components of them that are horrible. They are probably atrocious human beings in certain ways, meaning, how do we define atrocious? Meaning they're extremely narrow-minded and cruel with some of their perspectives and belief systems. So we have to kind of honor that most human beings are going to have some flares and a percentage of their orientation that is straight up fucking cruel, straight up dehumanizing. All right. And we kind of have to honor that's a reality. And I will tell you, every human being I've ever taken through an interpersonal journey of that, where they just do that own process, that is the greatest work they ever kind of come to, is finding out, holy crap, I perform cruel shit on a regular basis. I dehumanize people, including myself, on a regular basis. For a human being to come completely clean with themselves, that they are performing cruel and dehumanizing behaviors and practices on a regular basis to themselves and then to others, this is a huge courageous act, exceptionally difficult. All right. And then to share it with a collective, holy Christ, that's an extremely difficult process. It takes an enormous amount of trust in those that you're involved with. So if you choose to engage the collective shadow, you better be ready to honor that you are cruel as hell, that you have some shit in you that's cruel and dehumanizing. And you also need to give permission to other people that it's not okay that they're cruel and dehumanizing. It's just, it is what it is. We kind of have to honor this is the nature of many humans. This is the nature of what we have to deal with. No human is perfect. No human is a saint. It's not a matter of making it okay. It's a matter of, okay, we all got work to do. We've all got some horrible shit we've done, most likely. All right. And it's all going to be an incredibly courageous act to come to terms with that horrible shit that we've done. Okay. Especially if we've done a lot of it. Okay. This is one of the most difficult things most addicts have to come to terms with, is that they've done horrible shit for really shallow fucking reasons. okay? And to come to terms with that is a huge journey, is a huge act of courage, a huge act of personal trust and collective trust. So we want to give people permission to be humans. We got to give them permission to be horrible, to be a mess. We got to know they're going to fail, but we got to know that it's worth trying again as we go through this collective shadow experience. We also want to give others permission to never reach their fullest potential. We got to give people permission to not live up to our expectations. There are some humans in the world that this concept, or let's rephrase this. If I have a concept or a projection, an ideal of fullest potential, that's going to be different than a lot of mainstream or typical or mainstream traditional characters that are out in the world. So this means that any success that they make, any growth they make, I have to remember to honor as their manifestation of their fullest. All right. They may never reach my understanding of what an individual human's fullest potential is. And each human being has their projection of what the fullest, greatest human being ought to be. And so we kind of have to put to bed this idea that just because we have an integral map doesn't mean that every human being has the potential to fulfill everything on the integral map. The reality of evolution is not everybody gets to be everything all the time. All right. There are certain human beings that definitely will not reach great development in certain lines of intelligence. They will always kind of struggle to integrate certain quadrants of their reality. They will have a very difficult time going through stage development. And we kind of have to give people permission to not be amazing and reach their fullest potential based off of fullest potential, meaning a certain, ceiling or pinnacle or finish line. So these are some things that I've found that a lot of folks kind of struggle with, especially in social justice movements, especially in healthcare industries. I mean, coming from the massage therapy industry and the chiropractic and the kind of complementary alternative medicine community, there is a huge finish line of what a human being is supposed to be healthy as, what they're supposed to look like, what they're supposed to eat, how they're supposed to have their relationships, what their relationship and philosophy of disease are. So there's this real kind of shoving on of a projection on all of humanity about what they're supposed to be like. And this is an expectation. This is oftentimes a false expectation of what a human's fullest potential may be. So we kind of have to give people their permission to fulfill themselves the way they know how to fulfill themselves. And maybe that creates friction in the community, but even still, that's their growth process. We humans have to understand we are not the ones controlling everyone's evolution. We have to understand as individual human beings that we only have a certain amount of power over our own evolution, not to mention a collective's evolution. So we have to give each other permission, just like we give ourselves permission, to grow as much as we're able to in the spaces we're able to. And that life isn't just about growth. Life is also about being. It's about experiencing the territory. So we have to give humans permission. Once again, we have to give humans permission to be humans. We have to legalize being human. We have to legalize being a fucking mess sometimes. We have to legalize being art, evolving and composing and unfolding the way we unfold. And this is a difficult negotiation for a lot of folks, but this also increases the probability of you staying, of you participating, of you engaging collective shadow and seeing gains wherever those gains are. This is another thing, and it's a wonderful leeway into the next element. If you are participating in the community, any hint of success, honor that as success, okay? If you see even the smallest sign of a deepening, of a larger integration, of dynamism being accepted, of people striving and growing, either upwards or downwards, into their depth or into their height. Any direction of growth that you see, even if it's just one or two individuals growing a little bit at in your opinion, a snail's pace, that is still success. And if we have 100 of you folks going out into the world, creating a snail's worth of success for just a few individual human beings, that is a collective success. That is a collective win. Once again, like I mentioned, we will most likely not see the complexity of the fruits of our labor because we don't go home with the people that we serve. And so we have to surrender success looking a certain way. We have to give permission to evolution to do its work. And so we oftentimes suggest refocusing on honoring whatever success occurs is a success. We want to consider ourselves successful if we see the chains moving in any way. All right. So we want to kind of be mindful as far as that. And that's a really wonderful philosophical orientation to take when we're doing with this stuff. Another idea is to remember that you must work within your resources. As far as your resources are concerned, you have to work those. If you want to do bigger things and you want more resources, you're part of a fucking collective. That means you need to ask some fucking help. Okay. So it's not one of those things where you just get to whine and complain if you don't have the right resources, or if the resources aren't being used in the correct way, and you think you're going to help the world just on your own. That is the most backwards idea of engaging personal or collective shadow that you could come up with. So we need to understand that if you're going to engage collective shadow, you need to do it with a group. You need to be a part of a community. You need to participate with other people, and you have to enlist other people to help that process out. This is extremely important for a lot of folks in all types of territories engaging collective shadow. They do their work, they work really hard, and they never think to ask for help from other people in their community. One of the primary ways that great movements occur is when people that are deeply committed to the work ask for help and get all these people to help them out. That's how big movements happen. And so there has to be this understanding that you must recognize that you can only work within the resources that you have at hand. And if you need bigger movement, if you want to make a bigger impact, you need more resources. That means more help, more contributions from other human beings that are a part of your collective, whether inside the group or outside of the group that you're engaging. So these are extremely important points to pay attention to as you go forwards. Another component. Oh, I already covered this one. All right, another victory. All right. There we go. There's that one. The last one here, give yourself permission to finish. Okay. This is different than the disengage one. Remember that in your lifetime, in my lifetime, in your children's lifetime, they may not see a quote unquote end to sexism, racism, xenophobia, homophobia. We may never see the end of it. Most likely there isn't an end of it because we keep on making more human beings that have to be educated and fuck up that education and be problems in relationship to those issues. So there's no end to it. The end of racism, sexism, xenophobia is most likely the end of the human race. That's probably the only real end we're actually going to see. So inherently what we have to do is we have to understand that there most likely is no end. There's just the containment. There is the decreasing of the phenomenon. There is a minimization of it as much as possible. There's a consistent infrastructure and education and language and cultural orientation towards holding those portions accountable, exposing them and integrating whatever's going on with them. So we want to have the lowest amount of probability of those things unfolding. And we want to have the lowest probability of individuals with those orientations, with that type of confusion and or trauma showing up in power positions. That's the worst fucking case scenario we can think of, is having someone traumatized with this flavor of shadow in positions of power. All right. So we want to be deeply, deeply careful of that. And this means that we understand that we have to finish at some point in time. We have to honor that being a finite creature in the face of the incredible momentum of generations occurring, of a whole huge country and population of human beings, we will most likely not see the end of these things. And we have to remember that it is okay to finish when we're finished. Okay, that if you feel like you've contributed the time that you want to contribute to it, you can then pass the buck, pass things on, not pass the buck, pass the baton, share things, allow others to take over as far as things are concerned and do their part. These are very difficult decisions to make. But it is okay for us to move out of certain power positions to maybe just live in a smaller circle and just care for the smaller community that's around us. This can also have a powerful effect on collective shadow, but this is also something to consider as you're going forward and as the years and decades tick by, if you're willing to do this in the face of collective shadow for decades. So these are the kind of ways that we can create. These are suggestions that we make about engaging collective shadow. Like I said, some of them are similar to personal shadow, some of them are not. But it is if you're going to do collective shadow work, if you're going to engage collective shadow work, there has to be some collective agreement on this. We have to create, we have to cultivate a power of the we quadrant. We have to cultivate common language. We have to cultivate education and fluency in shadow and in trauma and what recovery can look like. We need to do self-care. We need to know that we have to contribute our part, and we are not the only ones defining what's going to happen within that culture, within that collective shadow. We have to understand that we have to do our own shadow work in the face of connecting to collective shadow work. Treating or engaging collective shadow work, I'll be honest with you, probably isn't the work of every human being out in the world. I think it's the work of the majority, because we're all constantly contributing to the collective. We're all constantly contributing to a culture, whether we know it or not. We're constantly contributing to a culture. And I think that it's worth a conscious choice to show up in the culture and engage the culture in a way that's going to be supportive for it and supportive of us. If we have individuals that are very excited, that haven't done enough work on themselves and are not educated and fluent in the integral map or in in being human and recovery, then we're going to have probably a lot of botched attempts. But it does very much begin with engaging the problem, with honoring the problem, educating around the problem, communicating and creating fluency around the problem, and then creating institutions and spaces for that shadow material to be experienced, embodied, integrated, and then do some type of reconciliation afterwards. But there does need to be reconciliation afterwards. There does need to be embodiment and engagement. There does need to be education and fluency. Otherwise, and not just for a generation either, not just for a certain group. It's not like if the people that are currently alive right now, if they do the best work that could possibly be done, it doesn't mean, in 100 years, people are not going to still be dealing with this situation. It's not like we can cut it off. We can plug the leak now, and other generations in the future, 100, 150 years from now, won't have to deal with this. That's a misnomer. It's not true. So we have to keep in mind that we have to keep these systems in place, these institutions in place, for humans to go through them, for humans to participate, and for these traumas to be integrated of the past, but then also for, in the future, if we have other traumas come up, if we have new realizations that we make about our humanity, and if we realize other transgressions along the way, we need these things in place for later on as well. This isn't just a passing fad or a thing that we can get done in the next 2 or 3 generations, and then humanity will be right as rain for a while. So this is big work. It's long work. It's unending work, and it's worthy work. It's extremely worthy work. Just like it's worthy to do this interpersonally, it is worthy to do it in the collective. All right, so there's a whole lot of information there for you. I've been talking at you for a while. So we got about 10 more minutes left on this call. I got to remember to start asking questions a little bit earlier. Does anybody have any questions from our group right now that want to get on the chat or anything like that, wants to chime in? Yeah, I'll give you just a second here. can use your audio or the, okay, yeah, right on. All right, so, really briefly, I'm going to do a plug for ITB. If you've been listening to this, thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks, Natalie. I appreciate that. I'm getting a compliment. Thank you very much. If you, a little plug for ITB, this is the reason I made this assessment, okay, years ago. And this is one of the reasons why ITB is in place. So if you're interested in working with Collective Shadow, or when I considered what do I do in the face of Collective Shadow, my opinion was, all right, I'm going to go ahead and create this opportunity for people to go through these things. So if you're interested in working your own shadow, this is one of the places that we do it. We are working actively. ITB as an institution is working very hard to create opportunities for people to show up and do some of this collective shadow work stuff, do some of this collective integration. We are a fledgling company. We have a lot of stuff in place for massage therapists and other folks along those lines, but we do not have a whole lot for the rest of the collective community. We are growing in that direction though. So any donation that you make along the way is extremely helpful. Also, this is the kind of coaching that I do specifically. Some of the other stewards are aware of this stuff, but this is definitely stuff that I definitely coach in and give suggestions and more along the lines of consulting on. So if you are a part of any community, this is a wonderful way of kind of getting some help and getting support as you investigate that, if you are wanting to engage as far as that community is concerned. If you're wanting any kind of personal work, once again, plug for our coaching and consulting for ITB, go to itb.org, look for our online coaching option. Right now, between now and September 1st of 2020, we will be doing a sliding scale of $25 to $85 an hour. That's 85 is the usual rate for our coaching sessions or for any sessions of ITB. So between 25 and 85, you have an option to pay, and we want to welcome as many people as possible into that option. You can get training in shadow work and all things ITB, as well as guidance and coaching through different types of meditation and working through that work. So my name has been, that was hilarious, totally forgot my name for a second there. My name is Jeff Koshin West. Thank you very much for participating. Come see us at embodyingitb.org. Find us on Facebook under Integral Transformative Bodywork. We're also on Instagram under that same handle. Come find us, come join us. Let's work together in order to deal with this personal and collective shadow and do our part, throw our hat in the ring, and contribute in some form or fashion to the decreasing of the collective shadow on planet Dirt. So come and see us. Thank you for your participation. Thanks for paying attention. We wish you well. I wish you great health. I wish you great rest. I wish you great insight. And may that be for you, and may that be for all the people that you find relationship with. Take care. Tons of blessings. Thank you very much.